Well, joining me now, Sky News host and News Corp columnist Peter Credlin. Now, Peter, Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews, he's standing by Victoria's controversial Belt and Road deal with China, despite this diplomatic row over Beijing's inflammatory tweet. This is what he had to say earlier today.
Well, I wouldn't enter into agreements unless I thought they were in the interests of our state, so you can logically deduce that.
This guy's got to be kidding, hasn't he, Peter? I mean, this is now a national security issue. Beijing have made it very clear they don't want anything to do with us. Is there federal legislation pending which would prevent Victoria from going down this path?
Well, the legislation's in the parliament. It's yet to pass the parliament, Gleeson. But if it does, the government's been, none too shy, saying that one of the first things that would go, or they'd certainly look at, repealing or rescinding, as it would be, because they can't repeal it at a federal level, would be this deal with China, between Victoria and China. What's interesting is this didn't go to an election. The people of Victoria didn't have any say before he went down this path. And today, Daniel Andrews wouldn't rebuke a minister who was silent on his defence, or not, as the case may be, of Australian troops over the Chinese tweet. So this is what happens when you do a deal with China. You're up to your eyeballs in Chinese debt, and they own you, and they come back and they want a payday. And they got a payday out of Victoria today because the Victorian government, which should stick up for our military, because the military are the ones that are bailing Andrews out of his quarantine mess. They've been doing it for months down here, mopping up all the things he did and didn't do. And now when they restart quarantine on the 7th of December, it will be heavily involved with the ADF. Now, why should the Army put its neck on the line down here in Victoria for Daniel Andrews, politically speaking, when he won't stick up for them against China? And I think the government federally is absolutely right to say enough's enough.
Peter, this is extraordinary. You've been around politics a long time, as I. I've never seen the inflammatory rhetoric that's coming from Beijing at the moment. I mean, what do we do with this mob? Because seriously, it's increasingly obvious they don't want anything to do with us.
I think you've got to treat the relationship carefully. I think, I've been there in Beijing, and I've been in meetings where President Xi is there. So let's not be cavalier about the economic relationship we have with China. But dollars doesn't buy our values. And so there is a line that gets crossed, as there was with that tweet, very deliberate, very high-ranking official. It wasn't language we could all say was miscued or something was lost in the translation. It was very clearly a doctored image that caused the greatest offence. Now, the Prime Minister's right to enter the fray. The Prime Minister's right to call it out. But I don't think there needs to be a pile-on from other ministers or anybody else at this stage. I think we've said our piece. And we need to not walk back from anything we've said. I don't buy this line that the business community is putting around that we should shut up and, take the money type thing. I don't agree with that at all. But I also think it's not aided by, junior ministers or backbenchers or anyone else entering the fray. I think this is now at a very serious level. We have to be very sober about it. And I think if the Prime Minister has entered the field, and the Prime Minister is the one that is speaking on behalf of our troops and our Australian identity, we should let that voice resonate and everybody else pull back from the commentary. I have no doubt there's many layers to our relationship with China, many levels in the bureaucracy as well. The officials will be working, 24/7 to try and get some level of backdoor rapprochement or discussions with China so that we can hopefully move forward. Not take a backward step, but at least move economically forward.
Sage advice. Now, the Lawyer X, I was going to say scandal, but it's becoming a soap opera. Nicola Gobbo told cops that Mick Gatto wanted to bed her. Now, of course, for anyone who's been living under a rock, Mick Gatto is a well-known, colourful character in Victoria. She certainly doesn't lack any confidence, Peter, does she?
No, but, it was a very difficult position. She should never have been in that position. She is a lawyer, a barrister. We were both contemporaries at law school together in Melbourne University. It's Lawyer 101, that you work for one side or the other. You're not the prosecutor and working for defence. You're not defence working for the prosecutor. And, of course, when you're working for the Victorian Police as an informant, you are crossing that line. Everybody knows it's the most fundamental principle when you are an advocate or a litigator in her case. Now, she was picked up by the police and signed on, and she stayed there happily in that relationship. It reads, you know, Damon Johnson in The Australian says, it's not like a Mills and Boon, it's far grubbier than all of that. I think it's really concerning. Victoria Police has spent something like $64 million trying to keep this out of the public domain, to try and bury it in legal action, managing the relationship that they had with Gobbo, because she was on the books 3 times. She had a almost $3 million compensation payment. I read that as, you know, shut up and don't say anything about this, keep it quiet, which of course it ended up going all the way through to the High Court. And the Herald Sun won the action to make this case public, which ended up, of course, in a Royal Commission. But the idea that you spend $64 million trying to bury this issue from the Victorian public tells you that from the get-go, the police knew what they were doing was against the law and against the morality of what should happen between a prosecutor and a defender.
Yeah, I think the culture at Victoria Police is one that needs to be obviously examined.
And this is not isolated, is it?
Fascinating.
This is not isolated.
No, of course not. Yeah, there's clearly an issue there, and obviously it needs to be sort of sorted out at some point. I'm fascinated, Peter, at the politics that is going on in the Hunter Valley in New South Wales, where you've got Matt Keane, the very keen New South Wales minister who's pushing energy and renewables, and then you've got Barnaby Joyce, you've got Matt Canavan, you've even got Joel Fitzgibbon saying Mark Latham saying, back off, brother, this is too ambitious. And it's, I think Barnaby referred to it as Pixieland power plans. I mean, you know, the fact that you've got Conservative politicians going at it against each other is quite extraordinary.
Well, let's not forget in New South Wales, they only have a very narrow margin in the state parliament, and I think that they've had a pretty difficult few. I mean, I think the Premier's done well out of COVID, but there's been a lot of friendly fire and other ancillary issues that have made her job harder, and some of them are self-inflicted. I don't walk away from that either, from Gladys Berejiklian. Now, they're going to go to the election was last March. They're 3 years now away from another election, but they will go to an election at some given time, and they've got to actually try and win more seats to hold on. They've only got, I think, 2 up their sleeve, and they're making life harder for themselves than they need to in regional areas. I think that Joel Fitzgibbon speaking up for coal is actually going to advantage him. I think people will give him a personal vote, even if Labor sort of are more difficult on the environmental front. But Matt Keane is actually going to turn things the other way for the Liberal Party. I think Matt Keane's going to make it harder for the coalition in regional and outer suburban parts of New South Wales. And if you look at the weekend, mate, when it was really hot down in Sydney, you know, 40-degree temperatures across 2 days, New South Wales was running at 80% coal-driven power. Renewables,
that's right,
you know, basically gave them absolutely nothing, because if the wind doesn't blow, or it's at night when you want your aircon on, you don't have solar power at night, and if the wind's not blowing, you don't have wind power either. So I think Keane is absolutely barking up the wrong tree. And yes, you'll get, you know, a seat like the federal seat of Wentworth, you know, might become a little bit safer, but they're not going to win it any more than they're always going to win it if it's a Liberal Party seat.
No.
You might make some of those seats tinging with green a little bit more likely to go and stay green, or the red seats are likely to stay red. But he's not going to move seats from one side of the ledger to the other side of the ledger, but he could lose them. He could lose them.
Yeah. I think Gladys needs to call Matt Keane in and have a pretty solid conversation. Peter Credlin,
I would reshuffle him out, mate. I would reshuffle him out.
Would you? Get him out?
Yep.
Yeah.
I just would not have him in that portfolio. I think it's very, very difficult for the coalition.
Yeah, very dangerous, isn't it? Great to see you tonight, Peter.
Good to be with you, Gleeson.